The Last of Us 2 seems to be mirroring The Last of Us in many ways that are quite interesting to note. From what's been said about it by the creators and from the footage that's been released so far, it seems to suggest that they're going in quite a different direction with the story in this one. Almost an opposite direction, in fact. The creator, Neil Druckmann, has said that while the first game centres on love, The Last of Us 2 will centre on hate. It's apparently going to be a story about revenge and killing, which I think is in stark contrast to the first game being about hope and survival, and I find it really interesting that they've decided to go in this direction with the story. And it's a good thing that they've decided not to just redo the same thing again. They've gotten what I presume is a good story that stands on its own and will have its own weight to it, which is important. It's too easy for games, especially ones as big as The Last of Us, to get lazy and rely too much on their brand. It also mirrors the first game in that the original was set in a dark world of despair, but the story is ultimately very hopeful and was about hope and innocence shining through this post-apocalyptic environment. While the second game is of course in that same world, it will be starting off in Jackson, Tommy's town. They're starting it off in a safe place that they're comfortable with, a relatively peaceful location they've long since settled in, and then it seems that violence, destruction and death will seep into this life that they've built for themselves. So this is essentially in some ways the opposite of the first game, so it's really interesting to see that they're doing something really different with it, and I'm looking forward to seeing where they take it. It is this destruction and death that apparently will spur on the storyline of hatred and revenge. Ellie's goal in this game apparently will be to take revenge and kill, whereas in the first game Ellie's goal was of course the opposite, simply survive and even further to save people. When you compare these two story premises, it's actually slightly disheartening in some ways, but I think that's the point. One of the things I loved about the first game is the way Joel is sort of a guy that's lost all hope, but then he finds hope in Ellie. So naturally to see The Last of Us 2 to be a game where Ellie sort of takes Joel's place and is the one that loses hope is somewhat depressing, but I think that's why they're doing that. It's choosing to do this because that's what it wants to be about, and it's really hammering down that hopelessness. I've seen some people speculate that it's specifically called The Last of Us Part 2 because it's the second part of one story. It's a continuation of the same story of the first game. Personally though, I sort of see it differently. From what I can tell, it definitely seems like its own standalone story, separate from the first game. Of course, while it is continuing on from the first game, I think it's going to be completely standalone with a new story that's separate from the original. From what I've heard about it, I can easily imagine that you could play The Last of Us 2 without even having heard of The Last of Us. Plus, unless I'm mistaken, The Last of Us was originally meant to only be one game. When it got released, they weren't making plans for a sequel, and Druckmann said that they would only consider doing one if it was a story really worth telling and that's not repeating itself. So that, combined with the fact that it seems like it's going to stand on its own and have a completely different weight to it, makes me separate it from the first game in some ways, which I think is what the creators are trying to do by making it different by mirroring and making it contrast so heavily with the story of the first game. They're not out to repeat the same trick twice. They're here to do what they do best, create a brilliant story in a video game. And if they can do that with characters that people are already emotionally invested in, then it massively adds to the impact of the story they're trying to tell and the feelings they're trying to make the players experience. For example, they could do a revenge story with a completely new game, but this has a much bigger impact because we are already invested in and care about these characters and know what they've been through. So really it's a stroke of genius, I'd say, to choose to tell a new heartbreaking story with characters that people have already spent so much time with. Furthermore, The Last of Us 2 seems to be the opposite of The Last of Us in that in The Last of Us you start off as Joel without Ellie, and then eventually she joins you in the game, whereas from what we can gather, in The Last of Us 2 you start out as Ellie without Joel, but then he presumably joins her, judging by the clips that have been shown at least. Which, considering I said I think Ellie might sort of take Joel's place in this game as the one who's lost hope, makes me wonder if Joel will do for Ellie what Ellie did for Joel in the first game. Plus, in the real world, it should be noted that The Last of Us 2 mirrors the original game, in that they're both late titles on their respective consoles, sort of defining their respective generations by pushing the equipment they run on to its limits. The Last of Us pushed the boundary of what the PlayStation 3 can do and was considered a fantastic AAA game to send that console off with in the year the PS4 came out. I can well imagine that The Last of Us 2 will do that for the PlayStation 4 in 2020, likewise the year the PlayStation 5 is due to be released. I also remember before The Last of Us came out that there was massive hype surrounding it, and it definitely lived up to it. Again, people seem to have little doubt that The Last of Us 2 will live up to the hype. That's also surrounding this game as well, considering Naughty Dog's reputation of delivering such great stories and gameplay. The game's co-director even wrote on Twitter, "We bout to redefine AAA in 2020. A bold statement, but people seem to fully believe that the developer's confidence isn't unwarranted, and quite rightly so. Even the covers of each game reflect this love and hate contrast between the two games. The Last of Us PS3 cover is really bright, showing Joel and Ellie walking towards a gorgeous bright sun, despite getting bogged down in water, which could sort of represent the struggle that they're going through to try to get to a bright future, I guess. There's so much to look at in this picture, it's just generally a beautiful image. I even bought it as a poster. Meanwhile, The Last of Us 2 cover is literally just black, apart from simply a dark image of Ellie's face, showing an expression of pure hatred. Completely the opposite of the first title, and both covers really do a perfect job of setting the tones of their respective games. Today is the day The Last of Us 2 was originally slated to come out, but it got delayed in October to the 29th of May this year. Ironically for me, I think it actually got delayed literally a day after I finished the first game, so while I haven't been waiting long at all for it, at least compared to the poor souls that have been waiting since it was announced in 2016, I'm very eager to see how this game reflects The Last of Us and tells a unique story in doing so, and as a result, I'm immensely looking forward to playing The Last of Us 2.